As we continue our journey on the book of Esther, as I said before, we would have gone through chapters 1 and 2, and now we are engaging chapter 3. We're engaging chapter 3. And, this is where the excitement begins. This is where the excitement begins. I hope and pray that you would have read the chapter. We won't do the entire chapter today. I'm hoping that we will be able to cover it in, at minimum, well, at most, 3 sessions, if not 2 sessions. So this week and next week. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to finish this chapter in 2 or 3 sessions. Please do have your questions available, ready, and your sharp minds ready to contribute to the discussion, ask questions, share your opinions, and, let's have a healthy one. So we are going on to chapter 3. And I'm going to go on the assumption that it would have been read. And so I won't need to read it in its entirety, but where it becomes necessary, I will, read. I would read the necessary verses. All right, so chapter 3 has 2 major announcements and conflict. Announcement 1, the king has decided to honor Haman. And the second thing that the king has put into law is the bowing down before Haman. So those are 2 of the major things that the king. There's a third thing that the king would have done, a third major thing that the king would have done, and that is to give Haman his signet ring. We're going to talk a little about that, maybe not today. But out of that, 2 primary conflicts arose. Haman and Mordecai. So there's a conflict between Haman and Mordecai. And then there is a wider conflict between Haman and the Jews. So let's look at the sequence of events. So in verse 1, we see the king decide to honor Haman. In verse 2, the means of honoring Haman would mean that the people would have to bow. All right, so he is honored above the nobles and the royals, and they would have to bow to him. So we see that in verse 1. Then we go down to verse 2. We see Mordecai deciding to ignore the king's edict in bowing to Haman. In verses 3 and 4, we see a kind of a secondary conflict. So we have the primary conflicts, that is between Haman and Mordecai, and Haman and the Jewish people. But we see a secondary conflict happening here in verses 3 and 4. In verses 3 and 4, we see where the royals are trying to coerce Mordecai into honoring the king's edict. Honoring the king's edict, but he remains resolute in his position that he is not going to bow. And what we see happening is that the royal officials, they went and complained to Haman about Mordecai's behavior. And we see Mordecai confronting, Haman confronting Mordecai in verse 5. In verse 5. Remember what Mordecai told Esther in chapter 2. He gave Esther specific instructions. And that instruction was, yes, do not disclose your heritage. Do not disclose your identity. Do not disclose your background. Do not disclose your heritage. But what we see happening in verse 4 is that Mordecai did not follow his own instructions. We see in verse 4 where he revealed to the officials at some point that he was a Jew. When we go down to between verses 5 to 7, we see the confrontation between Haman and Mordecai about kneeling and bowing to Haman. And one of the things that we see come into play, is the fact that Haman found out that Mordecai was a Jew. And so having found that out, his attention is no longer fixed on Mordecai only, but his attention now fixed on the entire Jewish population within the Persian Empire. When we go down, we see him getting enraged at Mordecai, and then we see him turning his fury towards the Jewish people to destroy them. In verse 7, we see Haman choosing a day to terminate Mordecai and to destroy the Jewish people. And this is significant, and we're going to talk about it. He actually took the time to choose a day when this was going to happen. In verses 8 and 9, we see Haman persuading the king to allow him to destroy the Jews. So we see him persuading the king to allow him to destroy the Jews, and the king put up no resistance. In fact, Haman decided to bribe the king, offered him, I think it's shackles of silver, 10,000 to put in his treasury. But being that the king is wealthy, he never needed it. Nevertheless, having rejected the bribe or the gift, if you want to say, he proceeded to hand Haman the signet ring. That is a bold and dangerous move. Then where am I there? Yes. And then we see Haman now exposing the Jews. And that we see in verse 8, where he said to the king, this group of individuals, in essence, will be a problem. Paraphrasing, this group of individuals will be a problem. And that was his line of persuasion, his argument. They are going to be a problem, so therefore, getting rid of them is not a question of if, but a question of must. We spoke about the king rejecting the bribe, but gave Haman the full power, the signet ring. And that is very, very significant in the whole scheme of things. And that we see in verses 10 and 11. And then we see Haman now using the king's name, that's in 11, in 12, 13, 14, using the king's name on the letterhead and using the signet ring to stamp the edict that he wrote. And that edict was, on this particular day, all the nations within the Persian Empire must now turn on the Jews. And in a single day, this is how, crazy it was. On a single day, kill all of them. Men, women, boys, girls, do whatever you want to do with their possessions. But in verse 15, we realize that the edict handed out was one that brought confusion. The NIV describes it as bewildering. So the people, having received the edict, they themselves were now wondering, what does this mean and why is this necessary? Then people don't do anything, so why are we just going to get up and kill them? And so that's where that ended. Let's go to the first sequence. And the first question is, who was Haman? And why did the king choose to honor him? Who was Haman and why the king chose to honor him? Well, Haman emerged as the antagonist who was bent on destroying Mordecai and the Jews. And that's what we know of him from the text. But what did the text not tell us about him? That's something that we're going to find out. Well, according to the Jewish Encyclopedia, according to JewishEncyclopedia.com, Haman was a descendant of Ahab, the king of the Amalekites. He was a descendant of the king of the Amalekites. What do you know of the Amalekites? Well, they have always been an enemy to the Jewish people. They have always been an enemy to the Jewish people. The roots of the Jews or Israel and Amalekites goes back into the womb, goes back into the womb. What do I mean by that? Well, let me see if I have it here. Let us turn our Bibles to Genesis. Let's turn our Bibles to Genesis 25. All right. So let me find this here. Right. So when we turn our Bibles to Genesis 25, and let us go to verse 23. All right, let's start from verse 22. The babies jostled each other within her. And she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, the two peoples from which you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." Remember the story of Esau and Jacob? Well, yes. What we have happening in Esther with Haman and Mordecai had its genesis in the conflict between Esau and Jacob, because the Amalekites are from the lineage of Esau, and Israel from the lineage of Jacob. And so the battle between Haman and Mordecai did not just exist at that time. It is a generational thing. It is from their fathers of their respective nation. Israel here being the stronger, which is Jacob, and the Amalekites being the weaker, which is Esau. Even though Esau was older, as the text says, what God declared is that the eldest will serve the youngest. And we're going to see that playing out between Mordecai and Haman as well. So the Haman was of the lineage of the Amalekites. As I said before, father of Esau. Esau the father of the Amalekites. All right. Haman, while he was in the, I guess, while he was in the Persian Empire, he fell on hard times. He fell on hard times and he had to sell himself. Well, he was a barber for about 20 years. And then he had to sell himself into slavery. He had to sell himself into slavery. Guess who he sold himself to? Mordecai. So Haman was Mordecai's slave at one point. Where did it end? I'm not sure. At the time of the king's decision to elevate him, was he still slave to Mordecai? I don't know. But at some point, they had crossed paths, and that path led to Haman being Mordecai's slave. What did the Bible, what did God say would happen? The older will serve the younger. So using Haman and Mordecai, Mordecai would be the younger, and Haman would be the older, which leads to a second dimension. And I'll make mention of it later on. Or I probably could do it now. It was not possible for Mordecai to bow down before Haman. Why? Why it was not possible? Because God already established that the older shall serve the younger. And so if Mordecai had bowed down to Haman, it would have meant that he went against what God says. I don't know if Mordecai was thinking of it in that light, but he insisted that he would not bow. Haman also practiced idolatry, and he was an astrologer. And this will play a part in him choosing the particular day, on which he would destroy the Jewish people. Not only was he an idolater, and an astrologer, it is said that on his clothes there was an engraving or embroidery of an idol. So on his clothes there was an idol placed, embossed on it. What is also said about the Amalekites, and by extension Haman, is that they were a nation of sorcerers. They were a nation of sorcerers, to the point where they could transform or shift their shape to avoid getting caught. When we go to First Samuel chapter 15, when you go to First Samuel chapter 15, and this is the verse, the text provided to support the idea or the argument that they could shift shape and form and transform into animals. So verses 1 to 3 tells us that Samuel said to Saul, I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel. So listen now to the message of the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the who? Amalekites for what they did to Israel. So we see the battle between Amalekites and Israel, by extension, Haman and Mordecai, long before these two men even met. For what they did to Israel when we waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Now go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all their belongings. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. And one of the reasons why they insist on killing the animals is that the Amalekites could transform or change shape into the form of an animal. And so the Amalekites were sorcerers or into witchcraft and shaping. That particular point came from the Wikipedia. And we all know that, Wikipedia is not always the most reliable source to get information from. So I'm just putting that in there because of educational purpose, and it's information that I would have gleaned from my research. The question we get an understanding of who Mordecai is. I'm sorry, who Haman is. So the question now is, why did the king choose to elevate him? In our review of the king, Zaris, in our first chapter, we would have identified the fact that he was on a spiritual transitioning. He would have broke ranks with Babylon and Egypt, walking away from them as king over those two territories. And he also would have broken the religious ranks as well. And so he described himself or declared himself as adversary of the Devis or Devas, which is a religion that is described as evil. In fact, I was trying to find it back. In one of the sites I checked, it associated Haman and the meaning of his name with evil. With evil. And so my belief is the king chose to elevate Haman because of his involvement in idolatry and the king's transition into a life or a faith centered on evil. So I conclude that Haman was the spiritual advisor to the king, and he would represent the king's religion that is now being passed down to the people within the Persian Empire. If we realize that the king did not simply recognize Haman, but he would have set Haman above the royals and above the nobles. These are high officials. So he was high up. With this ascension, with Haman's ascension, it raises the issue of religious conflict. Religious conflict. Keeping in mind that Israel is God's people, and now Haman is presenting or representing a new religion, or it may not be new, but a different religion. And the conflict comes in that God's people are now required by law, to adhere and to worship. The edict to worship Haman shows that the king had a zeal for the faith and was confident in Haman. The directive to bow down before him would establish him as a religious figure and making his religious beliefs and practices a state religion. So Haman would now represent the religion of the Persian Empire. But the edict carries three implications which I identified. One implication is that bowing to Haman would mean bowing to evil, idolatry, and sorcery. So you would have an empire. You would have an empire that is now subject to idolatry, evil, and sorcery. So that's one implication. The second implication is that the Jews would have to choose between sticking to their faith or facing a fate of death. It's either you bow or you die. If you don't bow, it's either you don't bow and die, or bow and live. If you don't bow, then you will die at the hands of man. But if you bow, then you have to answer to God. And that was the predicament Mordecai was in. For it is well established that God is the God of Israel. And what is the first commandment? What's the first commandment? Thou shalt have no other God but me. That's the Old Testament. What's the first and greatest commandment? As Jesus expressed it, summarizes the 10 commandments. Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind, body, and soul. And the second is loving thy neighbor as thyself. So whether we're going to use the Old Testament first commandment or we're going to use the New Testament great commandment, either one would put Mordecai and Israel in a predicament where they either face the wrath of man or face the wrath of God. And I don't know about you, but the decision is simple. the decision is simple. The third implication, the third implication we see is spirituality, religion, and Christianity would become regulated by secular human authority. So that's the third implication. If Mordecai bows, it means now that Haman would be the head of the religion, and that religion could be regulated by the king. And there is one place in history where we have seen this failed experiment, and that is the church universally is judged by the actions of one particular religious group. The Roman Catholic is presented as the head of the church, but that's not true. By no means is that true. The Pope is the head of the Roman Catholic movement, not the head of the Universal Church or the General Assembly of the Church of God, Anderson, or the New Testament, or whichever other group, or even the Anglicans. No, the Pope is the head of the Roman Catholic Church. But it is oftentimes said that it is the Pope is the head of the church, and whatsoever the Catholics do, it is usually reflected on the wider church. And so we see this failed experiment taking place. In AD 313, Emperor Constantine recognized Christianity And he set out an edict recognizing Christianity nationally. And a few years later, it became the state religion. And today, we are still reeling and dealing with the effects of that decision. And so this is what Mordecai's action was warding against. Bowing to Haman and honoring the king's edict would regulate their faith and to human authority, and that should never be done. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to end here for this evening, and we are going to go to the mics. Next week, we are going to pick up, and I'm going to see if I'm trying to be measured in how much I present at any one time. So next week, we will pick up. Next week, we will pick up, and we will look at some of the other things as outlined in the passage. So thank you for listening, and may God bless you.